All right, welcome to the second video for Systems Week. I wanted to talk a little bit about heuristics because I feel like there's not a lot of in-class time to kind of go over these, and I wanted to at least give you an idea of what these were, so you could come to class with some questions prepared or some ideas, and then if we need to clarify in class, then we can. So this should hopefully be pretty short. But heuristics is one of those words that sounds a lot spookier than it actually is, right? Because it comes from, more scientific approaches to things. A heuristic is basically an approach to problem solving or an approach to self-discovery that uses a practical method. And if you're seeing this word and this definition for the first time, you're probably in the same space as I was when I saw it for the first time. I'm like, wait, what? And so we think about heuristics as things that enable a person to discover or to learn something for themselves. And why we care about heuristics and why they fit in this week specifically is that when we're looking at how systems work and how users or players are interacting with systems, we often evaluate systems using a set of heuristics. And so what I want to do in this video for the scope of the lecture this week is just look at a common set of heuristics and go over what those mean. So this set is Nielsen's heuristics. They're quite famous. So we'll have a kind of a brief look at Jacob Nielsen's 10 general principles for interaction design. And in this case, they're called heuristics because they are general rules of thumb and they are not specific usability guidelines. But because they're general, you can use these in heuristic tests, which lets you kind of basically check and see if your players can play the game without your help. And so that'll help you judge your game based on whether it does or does not meet these kind of like following 10 guidelines that Nielsen has set out. So these are 10, and it's important I stress that these are 10 very general heuristics. If you want something specific out of your game, you can actually just kind of create your own heuristic for your game and approach it like a checklist. So does my game have this? Does the player feel this? Check, check. And then it gives you kind of a simple way to evaluate whether your game is successful or not at doing this thing that you have set out to do. But here are Nielsen's. So I'll go over these pretty quickly, and then if there are any questions, we can talk about them in class where we have the opportunity to like actually interact and speak to one another. So the first of these is visibility of system status. Basically, as far as games go, this means that your game should always keep its players informed about what's going on through appropriate feedback and within a reasonable time frame. Players should be able to understand the scope of the game and know what's happening in it. That's fairly simple, and that's like one of the kind of core principles of designing a good game is making sure that a player not only has agency on the world, but understands what their actions are actually doing. Next is a match between the system and the real world. So as Nielsen puts it, the system should speak the user's language with words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user rather than, jargony or system-oriented terms. Match between system and the real world is really just about following conventions, and this is kind of where that idea of a player's pre-existing expectations might come into play. Again, this is one you can design around, but this is kind of like making sure that your players' expectations aren't unreasonably shattered. Next is user control and freedom. So this is really a player's ability to control the game and feel as though they are in control of their character's actions. As far as like the systems design interaction design stuff goes. Nielsen looks at this as like how users will kind of often choose functions by mistake and will need to be able to kind of back out of their mistakes and leave an unwanted state. This is kind of like your undo or redo button. Your game might support this, but I think that idea of player agency and control is really what you're looking for within this kind of like guideline piece. Next is consistency and standards. This is, again, looking at that relationship between a player's expectations and what your game is actually delivering for them. So does the game behave as they expect it would? Yes or no? Kind of a simple checklist item. Error prevention is all about, rather than having to show players, hey, the game crashed and this error pops up, or you've done something wrong and this error pops up, how do you prevent those errors from happening in the first place? This is all about having a bug-free game that loads properly. There are no missing textures or anything like that. That kind of stuff. And you can deep dive on like how to prevent user error, and maybe bother the GDSA about having a session on that. Again, I don't want this video to be super long, so I'm kind of going to gloss over that. But yeah, make sure that error prevention is all about what it says, making sure that the game doesn't end up in a state of error. Recognition rather than recall. This is basically a guideline for, it says, make sure that players can recognize key functions and recognize the controls in your game. Rather than having to sit and think about how to do things, they should easily be able to recognize what is expected of them. And this can be, if you've got breakable walls in your game, by having you signpost that by putting like cracks in the wall. A player might recognize, oh, those cracks mean I can break this, rather than having to kind of sit and think about what they have to do. Flexibility and efficiency of use is really your system's flexibility, how easy it is for players to use. If we think about not necessarily games, but interaction design in general, you see there are a lot of like options available in certain software packages for like power users. Hotkeys is a great example of different things that like accelerate or speed up the interaction for users that are experts. This way, your system or your game might have things that cater both to new and experienced users. And this might be, it could fall under, having remappable controls. It could be skippable tutorials, skippable cutscenes, that kind of stuff. But like flexibility and efficiency of use, again, as a general concept. Aesthetic and minimalist design does not necessarily mean that your art or your game's design has to be minimal. But this is like when you're presenting information to players, you shouldn't be presenting information that is irrelevant or stuff that's not needed in that current context of play. Because when every like extra bit of information you provide a player, or in general provide a person, starts to compete, and they're trying to process all of this at the same time, and that might cause some kind of cognitive overload where they can't actually focus on what the objective is. Next, we've got help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. Again, in the event that an error does happen, expressing what has happened in as plain language as possible is super helpful. Ideally, we want to be able to like constructively suggest a solution, but sometimes that's really hard. Again, this is a general nice to have thing. And so you can kind of decide how this might fit in your games. And finally, help in documentation. This kind of umbrellas your tutorialization concepts. But like ideally, we want players to be able to play the game without additional help, without documentation. In some cases, it might be necessary to provide tutorials or provide some kind of help file or within game, like a list of abilities or something like that. This is all about anytime you have to include something like that, it should be easy to find, easy to search, well focused, and not be like too large or overbearing. And that's basically it. It's kind of an overview of some of these checklist items, really, that you could look at and say, does your game support these ideas? Yes or no. You'll see these a lot more in second and probably like third year once you get into the user research course. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a primer on it, just to start thinking about examining your games as you're building them, or when you get closer to that full prototype stage. It will help you really tie that experience together and create much more polished systems. But that's it for this one. So apologies, the other one came in a little bit long. This one's just a nice, cool 11-12 minutes. So thanks again, and I will see you in class.